In this video, we'll learn about the refraction section of the V-Ray material. For this scene, we got these bottle and glass geometries. Later on, we'll use these gem objects as well. I also have a shader ball in the scene, which we might not use it in this lesson particularly, but it would be useful later on. So let's open up the material editor by pressing M, create a new V-Ray material, and assign it to the bottle and the glass for now. You can also open up VFB and run the APR. Most of the refractive and transmissive materials don't have a diffuse component or have a very dark diffuse component. So let's zero out the diffuse color completely. Also, if you look at a piece of glass, you would notice very strong reflection. So let's use a reflection color with a value of 250 maybe. Now we are ready to start working on the refraction section. First, we have refraction color, which controls the color and the amount of the refraction contribution. When set to black, we won't get any refraction, and when set to brighter values, we start to get refraction and add transmissive properties to our shader. Sometimes you need to refresh the IPR session to get the shader to look correct. At 0 or pure black, you have no refraction, and as I increase the color value and use brighter colors towards white, we start adding more and more refractive or transmissive qualities to the surface. And at pure white, we get a fully refractive shader. We can use any other color to get a colored glass if we wanted. I don't know, you can use green, blue, or any other color that we want here as well. Let's use a pale blue color with the RGB values of 230, 246, and 255. And this will result in a uniform sort of fake coloration of the refraction component of the shader. There is a better way to get colored glass that considers the shape and thickness of the geometry using the fog parameters down here. We get back to that in a moment. For now, let's use a pure white color. To control how sharp or rough the surface is, you can use the refraction glossiness value. At 1, we get sharp refractions. And as I decrease the glossiness value, we get more blurry refractions, which results in a frosty glass look. You notice even though we get a frosty glass shader, but the reflections are still very sharp, and that might not be desirable, as in reality a frosty gloss in most cases would have rough reflections as well. So we can come up to the reflection section and decrease the glossiness there to 0.8 as well. Now we get a more realistic frosty glass shader. For now, let's set the reflection and refraction glossiness to 1. Like other parameters, we can control refraction glossiness with maps. In this case, let's load this floral 01 texture as the refraction glossiness map. This map is pure black and pure white. There is no in-between gray value. So where it's white, we get glossiness of 1, and where it's black, the glossiness would be 0. I don't want that here, so let's select the map and go to its output rollout. I'm going to enable color map, and let's first invert the map completely because I want the flowers to be darker and appear blurrier on the surface of the geometry. And now the right point controls the darker parts of the map. So let's increase it to 0.7 so they become a bit brighter and therefore cause less blurriness on the surface. Let me quickly hide the floor geometry as it is mostly white and a bit hard to see the effect. I know these geometries don't have proper UVs. If I go to the isolate selected mode and select the map in the editor, you notice it's not being applied correctly. So let's run it through a triplanar node. So add one from the V-Ray maps and use the floral texture as its texture input. and use the triplanar map as the refraction glossiness map. Increase the triplanar size to 35 centimeters and set frame offset to 30 centimeters. Just so that sim is not that visible. I'll be using the same map for the reflection glossiness as well, as I discussed before, and we start to see this floral texture kind of controlling both reflection and refraction glossiness values. Let me just stop the render for now and show you a saved render in the history panel. And here it is. For now, let's unhide the floor and set the reflection and refraction glossiness to 1 and run the IPR again. The next important parameter for refractive materials is IOR, or index of refraction. In the previous lesson, I talked about IOR and how it both controls Fresnel reflectivity and index of refraction. So when the material is only reflective, this parameter here, this IOR value here, only controls the Fresnel reflectivity, but when the material is both reflective and refractive, it controls both Fresnel reflectivity and index of refraction. So IOR here controls how much light rays will bend as they enter a medium. This value is 1 for vacuum, so the light won't bend in vacuum at all. 1.33 for water, 1.5 for household glasses, 2.41 for diamond. So that means the speed of light won't change in vacuum. For water, it means light rays travel 1.33 times faster in vacuum compared to water, and so on. So the higher the value, the more bending will occur for the light rays. You can find IOR values for different transmissive materials on the internet. As we are dealing with glass, let's go for 1.5 or 1.52, which is more accurate a bit. The next parameter I want to talk about is this dispersion AB number. To see how this works, let's hide the glass and the bottle and unhide the gems geometry and assign our shader. Now, dispersion AB controls how much the index of refraction varies across wavelength. By default, it is turned off, so let's enable it. The lower the value, the more dispersion the shader would have. Normally, you would use a value between 10 to 70 to stay in the normal range. Let's try 1. You can see we get a very, very strong dispersion. Maybe try 5, 10, maybe 20. So as we start increasing the AB number, the dispersion will become weaker. And if I set it to something like 70 or the highest value, which is 150, you can see the effects start to be less noticeable. The normal range is between 10 to 70. For diamond, you can use something like 55. For sapphire, around 72. So it's really up to you. We can disable dispersion altogether for now and hide the gems and unhide the bottle and the glass. Next, we have fog parameters, fog color, fog multiplier, and fog bias. Using these parameters, you can make realistic colored glasses. When you use the fog parameters to make colored glass, it kind of takes into consideration the thickness of the geometry. It doesn't apply the color evenly. Now let's change the fog color to a green color with the RGB values of 186, 245, and 129. And as you can see now, we have a green glass. But in the thinner parts of the object, we have a less saturated version of that green color. And in the thicker parts, we are getting more saturated, darker shade of that green color. So the color changes based on the thickness of the panes. Naturally colored glass has different shades of a color based on its thickness. Thinner parts will be tinted lighter and thicker parts will have darker shades of that color. Fog multiplier multiplies the fog effect, and as you increase it, you notice the fog color is more saturated. And if I start decreasing it, the fog color becomes less saturated and less colored. For now, let's set it to 0.3. And finally, we have this fog bias, which basically controls the contrast between the thin and the thick parts of the object. If I increase the value to, let's say, 1, the fog color becomes more even in the thin and the thick parts. And as we increase it more and more, this evenness becomes more visible. And if I decrease it to negative values, maybe -1, the contrast between thin and the thick parts becomes more obvious. So the thin parts will use less saturated colors and thick parts will be using more saturated and darker shades of the fog color and may look more opaque. For now, let's use white as the fog color. I'm going to set the fog multiplier to 1 and fog bias to 0. Now, you notice we get this beautiful transparent realistic shadows because this effect shadows is enabled. When disabled, we get this dark unrealistic shadows. Maybe it can be useful for compositing purposes in post, but you normally want to have it enabled. These effect channels specifies which channel will be affected by the refraction portion of the material. If set to color only, refraction affects only the RGB channel and not alpha. If set to color plus alpha, it will affect both RGB and alpha channels. And if set to all channels, it will affect all the eligible render elements. Also, we have this effect channels parameter in the reflection section of the material as well, which works exactly like this parameter here, but for the reflection component of the material. Next, we have max depth, which is the number of times a ray can be refracted. At lower values like 1 or 2, we don't allow the refraction rays to be refracted enough times and we get inaccurate results. The default value of 8 should be more than enough for most